The air in the executive suite of Thorn Plaza didn't just feel expensive. It felt pressurized, as if the very oxygen had been filtered through layers of capital and high-stakes negotiation. Elias Thorn sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, staring at the object that now rested between his hands like an unexploded shell. It was a black leather wallet. Handmade Italian calfskin, supple and smelling faintly of expensive tannins. To anyone else, it was a mundane accessory, the kind of item one loses in a taxi or forgets on a club table. But to Elias Thorn, who viewed the world as a series of transactional equations, this object had just broken the math. 10 minutes ago, he had been mid-sentence, negotiating a $40 million acquisition with a consortium of tech giants, when he realized the weight in his breast pocket was gone. It wasn't just the loss of the leather, it was the breach of his own seamless control. A man named Julian Vane, a ghost who had drifted through the lobby and into the sanctum of Thorn's private elevator, had stood before him, held out the wallet, and looked him in the eye with a terrifyingly steady gaze. Thorn had offered him $10,000 in cash, right there on the desk, as a gesture of dismissal and gratitude. It was a standard procedure: acknowledge the good deed, settle the debt, and return to the business of making billions. Vane had refused. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't even looked at the bills. He had simply said, "Keep it, Mr. Thorn. Some things are not worth the cost of holding them." Then he had turned and walked out, leaving a faint, sharp scent in his wake, not the scent of cologne or sweat, but something metallic and clinical. The smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike or a short-circuited server room. Now, alone in the silence of his office, Thorn felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades, a hairline fracture in his certainty. In Thorn's world, everyone had a price. If they refused money, it was because they were playing a different game, or because they were waiting for a better offer. But Vane's refusal hadn't felt like a negotiation. It had felt like a warning. Thorn reached out and touched the leather. His fingers traced the edge of his titanium membership card, peeking out from a slot near the spine. Everything looked correct. The credit cards were in their slots. The various identification papers were tucked into their translucent sleeves. He checked the cash compartment. The high-denomination notes he had offered Vane were still there, though he'd pulled them out to show him. "It's just a man," Thorn whispered to the empty room, his voice sounding thin against the glass walls overlooking the city. "A man who doesn't understand how the world works." But his mind, a machine built for detecting anomalies in data and market shifts, was already firing off red alerts. He was a venture capitalist. His entire career was predicated on identifying the glitch. When an algorithm deviated by a fraction of a percent, it signaled a massive shift in reality. Vane's refusal was that deviation. He picked up the wallet and brought it closer to the desk lamp. The light caught the grain of the leather, revealing something subtle. Under the intense glare, he noticed a microscopic irregularity in the stitching near the interior lining. It wasn't just a seam. There was a slight, almost imperceptible swelling behind the leather, as if something had been inserted beneath the surface. The irritation that had accompanied his loss evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharpening hunger for information. This wasn't just a lost item anymore. This was an anomaly. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a high-intensity forensic light, a tool he kept for inspecting fine art and high-value gemstones. He clicked it on, bathing the wallet in a deep violet hue. The results were immediate and jarring. Beneath the ultraviolet light, the interior of the wallet didn't just reflect. It glowed with a pattern that shouldn't have existed. Most people think of near-field communication, NFC, as something you interact with intentionally. You tap your phone to pay for coffee, or you scan a badge at a door. It is a technology based on electromagnetic induction, where two devices are brought within centimeters of each other so they can exchange data through a shared magnetic field. But the pattern appearing under Thorn's lamp was far more complex than a standard chip signature. A delicate, web-like lattice of filaments was visible just beneath the translucent lining of the leather. They weren't printed, they were embedded. It looked like a biological nervous system woven into the hide. The wallet hadn't been returned to him by chance. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that it had been delivered. The wallet wasn't just a container for his money and identity, it was a vessel. A Trojan horse designed to sit in his pocket, perhaps even on his desk, acting as a bridge between the physical world and something far more dangerous. If those filaments were what he suspected, a passive RFID skimmer or an advanced data interception array, the man hadn't been returning his property. He had been handing him a weapon. Or rather, he had been handing him a way to bypass every firewall in Thorn Plaza. The ozone scent suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't the smell of a stranger. It was the lingering ionization of a device that had recently been activated or tested. Thorne's pulse quickened. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to throw the wallet into the trash, to walk out of the building and never look back. But he didn't. Instead, he felt the familiar, predatory focus that had made him one of the most feared men in global finance. If someone was attempting to bridge his air-gapped networks through a piece of Italian leather, they weren't just looking for a payday. They were looking for a way into the core of his empire. He picked up his secure line and dialed a private number. He didn't call his security team, he didn't call the police. Those people followed rules, and Thorne was currently operating in a space where the rules had clearly been rewritten. "Sarah," he said when the call connected. "I need you at my office." "Now." There was a brief pause on the other end. Sarah Jenkins was a forensic cybersecurity expert who specialized in the things most people didn't believe existed: digital ghosts, hardware-level breaches, and the intersection of physical matter and encrypted data. She lived in the invisible layers of the world, the code that governed reality behind the glass screens. "It's late, Elias," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a hint of curiosity. "What happened? Did the market dip?" "No," Thorne said, his eyes never leaving the violet glow of the wallet's hidden skeleton. "I just found something that shouldn't exist. I need you to look at it. And Sarah, bring your full kit." "Everything. A physical breach?" she asked, her tone shifting into professional gear. "Something much worse," Thorne said. "Bring everything." He hung up and sat back in his obsidian chair. The city lights twinkled outside his window, a vast grid of electricity and information, pulsing like the very thing he was holding in his hands. For years, Elias Thorne had believed that everything could be bought, sold, or negotiated. He believed that if you knew the price, you owned the outcome. But as he stared at the black wallet, he realized he had been playing a game of checkers, while someone else had just walked onto the board with a piece he didn't recognize. The transaction hadn't ended when Vane walked away, it had only just begun. He looked at the titanium card one last time. It was the key to his kingdom, the physical anchor for his entire digital life. He realized then that this wasn't just a leather wallet. It was an invitation to a war he didn't even know had been declared. The elevator ride up to Thorne's private sanctuary was silent, save for the low hum of the high-speed cables. When the doors slid open on the 84th floor, Sarah Jenkins didn't even bother with pleasantries. She carried a heavy, hard-shell Pelican case that looked more like it belonged in a DEA raid than a corporate office. "You sounded different on the phone," she said, setting the case on the polished obsidian conference table. "Not, I lost my temper at a board meeting, different. More like, I think I'm being hunted, different." "The wallet is compromised," Thorne said, his voice flat. He didn't look up from where he sat watching her unpack. Sarah paused, a forensic scanner in hand. She looked at the black leather object sitting under the UV lamp. "Compromised. Elias, it's an expensive accessory. If you lost $1,000, it isn't about the money, Sarah. Look at the lining." She leaned in, clicking on the high-intensity ultraviolet light. Under the violet spectrum, the interior of the wallet transformed. It was no longer just leather and stitching, it was a map. A fine, shimmering lattice of hair-thin filaments pulsed with a ghostly luminescence, woven directly into the fabric like a spiderweb made of silver thread. Sarah's breath hitched. She didn't call out for help or scream, she simply went very still. "That shouldn't be possible. Explain it to me," Thorne commanded. She reached for her kit, pulling out a digital microscope and a handheld spectrum analyzer. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic clicking of keys and the soft whine of electronic sensors. Sarah's face, usually a mask of professional indifference, tightened into a grimace of pure technical fascination, the kind that precedes bad news. "It's a passive skimmer," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "But not like the ones they use in airports or subway stations." She pointed to the screen of her tablet, where a 3D render of the wallet's internal structure was taking shape. Usually, a skimmer needs a battery, a transmitter, and a way to store data. It's an active device. But this is different. These filaments are actually a specialized antenna array. They're designed for induction. Induction. Thorne leaned forward. "Think of it like this," Sarah said, her fingers flying across the screen as she illustrated the concept. Most digital security relies on the idea of an air gap, the belief that if two computers aren't physically connected by a wire or a local Wi-Fi signal, they are safe. But there is always a bridge: radio waves, electromagnetic fields, even acoustic vibrations. This wallet, it's a bridge. It doesn't need its own power. It uses the energy from the very cards inside it to wake up the filaments. When you pull your credit card out, or when that titanium key of yours brushes against the lining, the magnetic field from your card provides just enough juice to power this web for a split second. She tapped a specific junction in the render. It's highly sophisticated. It uses near-field communication, NFC, but it's tuned to a very specific frequency. It doesn't just steal your credit card number, Elias. It can intercept the handshake between your high-level authentication cards and a reader. It's designed to capture the digital handshake that unlocks encrypted systems. Thorne felt a coldness settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. An air gap jump. They used the wallet to bridge the gap between my physical person and my secure digital environment. It's worse than that, Sarah said, her eyes meeting his. Her expression was no longer one of curiosity, it was professional alarm. She began running a diagnostic on the data logs from the scanner's proximity sensor. I was checking for residual electromagnetic signatures to see if there had been a recent burst of activity. She paused, staring at the scrolling lines of code. What is it? Thorne asked. The device, it didn't just sit here waiting, she said, her voice dropping an octave. There was a massive, localized spike in data transfer about 40 minutes ago. Right around the time you were standing near the lobby entrance during your meeting with that man. Thorne felt as if the floor had tilted. That was before he came to my office. That was when I first encountered him in the plaza. Exactly, Sarah said, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through the logs. The data transfer happened while you were still walking toward your car. The moment that wallet entered his proximity, or rather, the moment it was near an active signal source, it did its job. It harvested the credentials and likely broadcasted a compressed burst of information to a receiver nearby. Thorne stood up, moving toward the window. Below him, the city looked like a circuit board, millions of lives pulsing with data that could be intercepted, stolen, or manipulated by anyone with the right tool. He thought back to Julian Vane's face, the unsettling calm, the way he had refused the reward not with greed, but with a look of profound, almost pitying warning. He wasn't just returning it, Thorne realized aloud. He was handing me the evidence of the crime. If he returned it because he knew what it was, Sarah added, her voice small in the vast office, then he wasn't a thief. He was a whistleblower. Or a messenger. Thorne turned back to her, his eyes hard. A messenger for whom? And if they were capable of planting this, my entire security perimeter is an illusion. I need to trace the component, Sarah said, already reaching for a specialized chemical reagent used for identifying rare earth alloys. This isn't standard off-the-shelf hardware. The way these filaments are etched, it's custom work. High-end, military grade, or something even more niche. Do it, Thorne said. I want to know who manufactures this specific lattice. I want a name, a factory, and a paper trail that leads back to whoever authorized its production. For the next 2 hours, the office became a forensic lab. Sarah worked with surgical precision, using an ion milling tool to strip away a microscopic layer of the wallet's leather lining. She wasn't looking for a serial number. She was looking at the molecular signature of the conductive ink used in the filaments. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed, while Thorne sat in his chair, staring at the black leather object as if it were a coiled viper. He thought about his empire, the hedge funds, the tech acquisitions, the sovereign wealth deals. It all felt fragile now, like a house of cards built on a foundation of sand. If someone could bypass an air gap just by standing near him, then no vault was secure, and no conversation was private. I've got something, Sarah said suddenly. She looked up, her eyes bright with the adrenaline of discovery. The alloy in the conductive ink. It's a proprietary composite, silver-doped graphene with a specific trace amount of ytterbium. It's incredibly stable and has a very high signal-to-noise ratio. Where is it from? Thorne asked. Sarah pulled up a restricted database, her eyes scanning through lists of chemical suppliers and aerospace manufacturers. It's not on the open market. But I found a patent filing for this exact composition. It was filed 5 years ago by a company called Aegis Data Systems. Thorne froze. The name hit him like a physical blow, echoing in the back of his mind through layers of half-forgotten history. Aegis Data, Thorne repeated, the name tasting like ash. I haven't heard that name since the collapse of the Helios project. Sarah looked at him, confused by the sudden shift in his demeanor. The Helios project. Was that a tech firm? Thorne didn't answer her. He couldn't. His mind was racing back to a boardroom 5 years ago, a high-stakes liquidation, a bankruptcy filing, and the frantic, whispered accusations of fraud that had preceded a scandal so massive it had wiped out 3 major venture capital firms in a single week. Aegis Data had been at the center of it. They had been accused of developing predictive surveillance tools for private intelligence agencies, but the company had vanished overnight during the investigation, its assets frozen and its leadership scattered to the winds. They didn't just vanish, Thorne muttered, more to himself than Sarah. They went underground. He stood up and walked back to the window. The realization was settling in, heavy and cold. This wasn't a random robbery. It wasn't even a standard piece of corporate espionage designed for quick profit. This was a ghost from his past, reaching out through a piece of leather to remind him that some debts are never truly settled. And if the technology used in this wallet was any indication, the people behind it hadn't been interested in his money at all. They had been after something much more valuable, something hidden deep within the digital architecture of his life that only they knew existed. Sarah, Thorne said, his voice low and dangerous. Stop looking for where the component came from. Start looking for what was stolen during those 40 minutes in the plaza. I want to know exactly which files were touched. Sarah looked at him, her face pale. Elias, if they bypassed your air gap, they didn't just take files. They could have planted something. A logic bomb, a backdoor, anything. Thorne stared out at the city, his eyes narrowing. The war hadn't been declared when Vane walked into his office. It had been declared years ago. He was just finally realizing he was in the middle of it. Then find it, Thorne said. Before they use what they took to finish us. The chandelier light at the Grand Meridian Gala was too bright, a clinical, shimmering white that seemed designed to expose rather than illuminate. Elias Thorne stood near the periphery of the ballroom, a glass of vintage Krug in his hand, though he hadn't tasted a single drop. He felt less like a titan of industry, and more like a man standing on a thinning sheet of ice. He had spent the last 3 hours performing the most difficult task for a man of his temperament, pretending nothing was wrong. To the room full of senators, CEOs, and tech luminaries, Elias Thorne was merely being his usual, inscrutable self, the predator who listened more than he spoke. But beneath the bespoke wool of his tuxedo, his skin felt tight with an agitation he couldn't suppress. Every time a waiter brushed past him, every time a security guard shifted their weight near the exits, his pulse spiked. He was being watched. Not by the cameras, he knew those were merely for show, but by something else. Something that existed in the gaps between the light. You look like you're calculating the cost of the room, a voice drawled beside him. Thorne didn't need to turn to recognize the cadence. Julian Vane's rival, Marcus Sterling, stepped into his line of sight. Sterling was a man built on momentum, loud, expensive, and perpetually moving. He held a flute of champagne like it was a trophy. The cost is always higher than the appearance suggests, Marcus, Thorne replied, his voice a practiced, neutral baritone. What brings you to this particular corner of the heavens? Sterling laughed, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the room with an intensity that mirrored Thorne's own. I heard rumors. Nothing formal, mind you. Just whispers in the mid-market circles. They say someone tried to pick your pocket in the plaza earlier today. Thorne felt the temperature in his immediate vicinity drop. He kept his gaze fixed on a group of diplomats across the room. A misunderstanding with an old acquaintance. It's been handled. Has it? Sterling leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to be conspiratorial without being caught by the nearby servers. Because I've been hearing something much more interesting than a simple theft. They aren't talking about your wallet, Elias. They're talking about ghost transactions. Small ripples in the dark pools. Micro-transfers that don't trigger an alarm because they look like nothing, just digital dust moving through the system. Thorne's grip tightened on his glass. A fascinating theory for a man who trades in speculation. I trade in reality, Sterling countered, his smile fading. He looked Thorne dead in the eyes, and for the first time, Thorne saw something there that wasn't arrogance. It was genuine, unadulterated fear. The Aegis signature showed up on 3 other high-net-worth accounts this morning. Not thefts. Just activations. As if someone pressed a button and woke up a sleeping dog. If you're being played, Elias, don't expect me to be the one to pull you out of the pit. Sterling moved on before Thorne could respond, leaving him standing alone in a sea of laughter and clinking crystal. Thorne retreated toward the terrace, his mind racing. Activations. Not thefts. The word sat heavy in his gut. If this were just about stealing money, it would be common crime. But if they were activating accounts, the wallet wasn't a tool for theft, it was a trigger. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a coded alert from Sarah. He stepped into the shadows of the balcony, the cool night air doing little to soothe the sudden sweat on his palms. He opened the encrypted message. It was a series of data packets, accompanied by a single line from Sarah. "It's not just you. The sequence has started." He scrolled through the logs she had sent. Her findings were terrifying. The wallet's RFID chip hadn't been used to siphon funds. Instead, it had functioned as a physical handshake. In cybersecurity, there is a concept known as a dead man's hand, a failsafe designed to trigger an automated sequence if a specific user or set of biometric keys fail to check in, or conversely, if they are presented in a very specific, highly unusual sequence. The wallet was the physical component of that sequence. By bringing the modified leather near his secure mobile device in the plaza, a device that had been bridged via the induction-powered graphene filament Sarah had identified, the handshake had been completed. It hadn't stolen data, it had signaled a dormant protocol to wake up. Thorne felt the world tilt. He wasn't the target of a heist, he was a component in a larger machine. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling. For the first time in 20 years, Elias Thorne realized he didn't know who was in control. He had always believed that power was something you built, brick by digital brick, through capital and influence. But this was different. This was systemic. The ghost transactions Sterling mentioned weren't just random ripples. They were the sound of a massive, automated mechanism grinding into gear. A realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Julian Vane hadn't been trying to steal his wallet. He hadn't even been interested in the money or the social embarrassment of the encounter. Vane had seen the handshake coming. The stranger's refusal of the reward, his unsettlingly calm demeanor, and his insistence on returning the object personally. It wasn't altruism. It was an attempt to break the sequence. By refusing to let the wallet stay in Thorne's possession, or by attempting to return it before the handshake could complete its cycle, Vane was trying to stop a clock that had already started ticking. Thorne realized with a sickening clarity that the stranger wasn't a thief. He was a witness who had seen the shadow of the executioner and tried to warn the condemned. A sudden chime from his phone interrupted his spiraling thoughts. It was an automated market alert. His eyes widened as he read the headline: Global liquidity swings, unexplained volatility in high-frequency trading corridors. The ripples were becoming waves. The ghost transactions were no longer just micro-transfers. They were beginning to move through the veins of the global financial architecture, triggered by a sequence that had been set in motion years ago, perhaps during the Helios project itself. This wasn't about an individual billionaire's wealth. It was about the integrity of the entire system. The dead man's hand was being played, and Elias Thorne was one of its primary cards. He looked back into the ballroom at the glittering crowd. They were dancing, drinking, and celebrating, completely unaware that the very digital foundation they stood upon was being systematically dismantled by a ghost in the machine. The scale of the threat had expanded beyond his control, past his security teams, and past his ability to litigate or buy his way out of it. This was an existential event. If the sequence completed, the ghosts wouldn't just own his money, they would own the reality in which that money held value. He needed Vane. The man was no longer a curiosity or a legal nuisance. He was the only person who had looked at Thorne's life and seen not a man, but a trigger. To understand how to stop the sequence, he couldn't rely on the digital tools that were currently being turned against him. He couldn't use his lawyers, his servers, or his satellites. The high-tech world was becoming a trap. To find the truth, and perhaps to survive it, Thorne would have to go where the data didn't reach. He had to go into the dark. The Gray District did not exist on any high-resolution satellite map Thorne used for his real estate acquisitions. It was a topographical scar of the city, a sprawling labyrinth of decommissioned warehouses, steam-venting subway tunnels, and low-income tenements that sat in the permanent shadow of the gleaming glass towers of the financial district. Here, the air tasted of ozone and wet concrete, thick with the smell of industrial decay and the constant, rhythmic thrum of heavy machinery from nearby shipping yards. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hiss of a pressure valve. She wasn't looking at the scenery. She was staring at the encrypted tablet in her hand, which had been flickering intermittently for the last 10 minutes. "The signal is being jammed." Not just blocked, it's being actively suppressed. Someone is running a localized white noise generator nearby. Thorne adjusted the collar of his coat, feeling suddenly, acutely exposed. The tailored wool felt like a costume in this environment. He looked at Sarah. Her usual professional composure was fraying at the edges. Her eyes were darting toward every dark doorway they passed. For years, Thorne had moved through the world protected by layers of digital armor. Private security details with encrypted comms, real-time intelligence feeds, and a wall of legal experts who could silence an accusation before it even reached a courtroom. Now he felt stripped naked. "If we lose the signal entirely, we're blind," Thorne said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "Can you bypass the interference?" "I can try, but I need proximity to a stable node," she replied, her fingers flying across the screen. "But every time I attempt a handshake with the local meshnet, I get an error code that shouldn't exist on this hardware." She turned the tablet toward him. The screen was bleeding red, a cascading series of failed authentication attempts. "It's not just noise, Elias. It's a denial of service attack targeted specifically at our signature. They aren't just watching us, they are erasing us from the network as we move." A sudden, sharp crack echoed from a side alley, the sound of breaking glass or perhaps something heavier hitting concrete. "Move," Thorne commanded, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward a recessed doorway. They didn't even have time to duck before two black, nondescript SUVs swerved into the narrow street, blocking their path with practiced precision. The vehicles didn't have license plates. There were no sirens, no shouting police commands. Instead, four figures emerged from the shadows of the parked cars. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized economy of motion, not soldiers, but cleaners. They wore matte gray tactical gear that absorbed the dim light rather than reflecting it, and their movements suggested they were trained to neutralize targets without leaving a single trace of forensic evidence behind. "Those aren't local security," Sarah hissed, her breath hitching. "Elias, those are professional extraction teams. This is high-tier private military." Thorne felt a cold dread sink into his stomach. These weren't the thugs hired by rival CEOs to steal a prototype or intimidate a board member. This was something else entirely. They were an organized response to a systemic breach, a specialized unit designed to sanitize a situation before it could reach the public eye. "Run," Thorne said. They bolted into the maze of the industrial alleyway just as the first flashbang detonated, turning the dim afternoon into a blinding, white void. The roar was deafening, a physical wall of sound that slammed into their chests and left their ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. Thorne stumbled, his boot slipping on a patch of oily sludge. He felt Sarah's hand grip his sleeve, pulling him forward just as the heavy thud-thud-thud of tactical boots began to close in behind them. They scrambled through a rusted service door into what appeared to be an abandoned server farm, a cavernous, hollowed-out shell of a building where rows of skeletal metal racks stood like the ribcage of a dead beast. The air was freezing here, chilled by old industrial cooling systems that had long since gone silent. "In here," Sarah gasped, pulling him toward a recessed alcove behind a fallen server cabinet. She frantically tapped at her tablet, attempting to re-establish a connection, but the device gave a final, pathetic chirp before the screen went black. "It's gone," she whispered, her hands trembling. "The GPS, the cellular, even the local mesh. We're completely off-grid, Elias. They didn't just jam us, they severed our digital umbilical cord." Thorne leaned his head back against the cold metal of a server rack, trying to regulate his breathing. The silence that followed the pursuit was more unsettling than the noise of the chase. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of being trapped in a vacuum. He looked at his hands, the same hands that signed billion-dollar mergers and dictated global market shifts. Here in this dark, hollowed-out shell, they felt small. "Useless." "We can't stay here," Thorne said, looking around the darkness. "If they find us, we won't make it out of this district." "They aren't just trying to catch us," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked at the blacked-out screen of her tablet. "I saw their comm signatures before they cut us off. They weren't using standard frequencies. They were using a burst transmission protocol, one that I haven't seen since the Aegis data liquidation." Thorne froze. The name felt like a physical weight in the air. "Aegis." "The money," Thorne muttered, more to himself than to her. "Every cent of my venture capital over the last decade. I thought I was investing in the future of data security. I thought I was building the infrastructure for the next century." He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh that sounded like grinding stones. "But I wasn't building a shield. I was funding the architect of a weapon. My own wealth. It built the very mechanism designed to erase me. The realization was a bitter pill. The irony was absolute. His pursuit of efficiency and seamless digital integration had provided the capital, the research, and the hardware for an entity that operated entirely outside the reach of human law. He wasn't just a victim of a crime, he was the unwitting patron of his own destruction. There. Sarah pointed toward the far end of the server hall. A single, flickering light was visible through a gap in the heavy steel doors at the rear of the facility. It wasn't the harsh glare of a tactical flashlight, but the soft, steady amber glow of an old-fashioned lantern. It looked impossibly out of place amidst the high-tech decay. They moved cautiously, hugging the shadows, driven by a desperate need for any information that could explain why they were being hunted like animals in their own city. As they approached the source of the light, the smell changed. The ozone and rot were replaced by something sharper, the metallic scent of solder and the dry, dusty aroma of old paper. They breached the doorway into a small, makeshift office, built into what had once been a master control room. Inside, the space was filled with an unsettling amount of analog technology: reel-to-reel tape recorders, cathode ray tube monitors, and stacks of printed ledger books. It was a sanctuary for someone who lived in the gaps between signals. In the center of the room, sitting at a heavy wooden desk, was Julian Vane. He looked even more haggard than he had in the plaza. His shirt was torn, and there was a dark, spreading stain on his side that suggested he had been injured during the chase. Despite this, his eyes remained unnervingly calm, focused on a series of handwritten notes spread across the desk. He didn't look up as they entered. He simply reached for a small, handheld radio and adjusted a dial. "The handshake is complete," Vane said, his voice raspy but steady. "You shouldn't have come here. The moment you stepped into the gray district, you became part of the sequence." Thorne stepped forward, his anger momentarily eclipsed by an overwhelming need for clarity. "What are you playing at, Vane? You didn't want my money. You didn't even want the wallet. Why did you bring it back?" Vane finally looked up, and for the first time, Thorne saw something in the man's eyes that wasn't calm. It was a profound, exhausted grief. "I didn't return it to be kind, Mr. Thorne," Vane said, gesturing toward the handwritten notes on his desk. "I returned it because I thought I could break the induction cycle by interrupting the proximity trigger. I thought if I introduced a physical delay, the data transfer would fail." He paused, a grim smile touching his lips. "I was wrong. The wallet wasn't the payload. It was just the handshake. And now that you've acknowledged it, the conversation has truly begun." He turned his chair slightly, revealing a second monitor, an ancient, clunky device that shouldn't have been able to connect to any modern network. On its screen, a single line of text was scrolling in an endless, rhythmic loop, cascading failure imminent. "Sequence 1A active." "The wallet was just the first step," Vane whispered, looking from Thorne to Sarah. "It's not a theft. It's a liquidation protocol. And it's already started." The air in the small, cramped room felt heavy, saturated with the scent of heated dust and something more clinical: the ozone of old circuitry struggling under a workload it was never designed for. Sarah Jenkins stood frozen, her eyes darting between the ancient CRT monitor and the man she had thought was just another eccentric survivor. "Explain it," Thorne demanded. He didn't say it as a command. He said it with the hollowed-out tone of a man who realized his entire life's work might be nothing more than fuel for someone else's fire. "You mentioned an induction cycle. You mentioned a handshake. What is cascading failure imminent actually doing?" Vane sighed, leaning back into his creaking chair. He reached for a glass of water on the desk, but his hand shook just enough to make the ice clink against the rim. "It's called a dead man's hand," Vane said. "But in this context, it isn't about death. It's about a legal technical vacuum. Think of it as an automated liquidation protocol designed into the very architecture of high-frequency, cross-border asset management." He gestured to the scrolling text on the monitor. "Most people think of hacking as someone breaking into a system to steal something. But this is about someone using the system's own rules to make things disappear legally. The dead man's hand is a piece of self-executing code, buried deep in the smart contracts and clearinghouse protocols that govern trillions in liquidity. It doesn't steal money. It triggers a series of pre-negotiated, automated sell-offs and transfers based on a specific set of conditions." "Like what conditions?" Sarah asked, her professional instinct overriding her fear. "A logic bomb. A piece of malware. No, Vane replied, looking directly at Thorn. It's much more elegant than that. It requires a physical validation event. Most high-level, air-gapped financial triggers require two things to prevent exactly what is happening now: a digital command and a physical, biometric confirmation from the authorized signatory. A person has to be there. They have to prove they are present, alive, and consenting. Thorn felt a coldness settle in his marrow that had nothing to do with the drafty room. The wallet. Exactly, Vane said. The silver-doped graphene filaments we found in the lining. They weren't just for eavesdropping. They were an induction bridge. When you stood in that plaza, the wallet used NFC proximity to create a momentary, high-frequency handshake with your personal device. It didn't steal data, it whispered a request into your secure environment. But a request needs a signature. That's where the second part comes in. He pointed toward Thorn's face. When you were walking through that plaza and that stranger, the man who was actually a highly trained technician for Aegis approached you with the wallet. He wasn't just returning your property. He was waiting for the precise moment of physical proximity. The device in the wallet used an ultra-wideband sensor to capture a high-resolution, sub-millimeter biometric snapshot of your face and hands as you reached out to take it. It didn't need your password or your fingerprint. It just needed the unmistakable, unique geometry of your presence at that specific coordinate. The moment you touched that leather, you signed the order. Sarah's breath hitched. The handoff was the biometric authentication. He used the transaction itself to validate a command that had been sitting dormant in the clearinghouse for months. And because it's a legal protocol, Vane continued, his voice dropping an octave, the system doesn't see this as a hack. It sees it as you, Elias Thorn, authorizing a massive, cascading liquidation of your holdings into a series of offshore shadow accounts. The cascade is the automation. Once the first transfer clears, it triggers the next, and the next, moving through different jurisdictions, changing currencies, and bypassing human oversight by moving faster than any regulator could ever monitor. It's a legal loophole, executed at light speed. Thorn stared at his hands. He had spent decades building an empire on the principle of transactional certainty. He believed in the sanctity of the digital signature, the absolute authority of biometric locks, and the unbreakable logic of the contract. Now, he realized those very pillars had been turned into a siege engine designed to crush him. It's not just you, Vane added, his gaze shifting to Sarah. This isn't a targeted assassination of one man's wealth. It's an extraction of liquidity. The ghost transactions Sterling saw. Those are the ripples from other signatures that have already been harvested. This is a systemic harvest. The realization hit Thorn with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about him being robbed. It was about his entire existence, his reputation, his influence, and his very capacity to interact with the global economy, being erased by an automated process that was technically behaving exactly as programmed. He wasn't fighting a criminal in a dark alley. He was fighting a mathematical certainty. We have to stop it, Sarah said, her voice rising. If we can trace the command sequence, if we can find the node where the biometric validation is being processed. You can't trace it once it's in motion, Vane interrupted, his expression grim. It moves through thousands of microtransactions every second. By the time you see a discrepancy on a ledger, the money is already gone, laundered through 10 different layers of non-transparent shell companies. You can't outrun an algorithm that is part of the infrastructure itself. Thorn looked at Vane, really looked at him. You knew. When you refused the reward in the plaza, you weren't being a saint. You were trying to stop the validation. You knew that if you took the money, or even engaged with me for too long, the proximity would trigger the final leg of the sequence. Vane nodded slowly. I tried to break the handshake by walking away. I thought if I could just keep my distance, the biometric capture wouldn't be clean enough to satisfy the protocol's precision requirements. But the system is smarter than that. It's designed to account for human error. It only needed a glimpse of you. Then why tell us now? Thorn asked. Why not just let it happen? If this thing is as unstoppable as you say, then we're already dead. Vane looked at the flickering CRT monitor. The text was still scrolling, but the frequency seemed to be increasing. Sequence 1A active. Liquidation in progress, 4.2%, 4.3%. Because, Vane said, the dead man's hand has one vulnerability. It's an automated process, which means it is incredibly rigid. It follows a very specific logic path. It requires the original authentication to be continuous. The biometric signature isn't just a single snapshot. It's a rolling validation that ensures the authorized user is still present and consenting during the initial burst of activity. Sarah leaned in, her eyes wide. A continuous handshake. If you can spoof the signal, if you can trick the system into thinking the original authentication is still happening exactly as it was in the plaza, you might be able to insert a halt command, Vane finished. But it wouldn't be done from out here. You can't fight this from an analog sanctuary or a hijacked laptop. The signal has to originate from the source of the initial handshake. It has to look like the original, uninterrupted stream of biometric and NFC data. Thorne's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what he was hearing. The only way to stop the cascade wasn't to outsmart the machine with better code. It was to go back to the moment the trap was sprung. They had to return to the very site where his digital empire had been turned into a weapon against him. The office, Thorne said, the word feeling like ash in his mouth. We have to go back to my office. It's too dangerous, Sarah whispered. The cleaners are already patrolling the gray district. They'll be waiting for us to attempt a countersignal. They aren't just waiting for us, Thorne said, standing up, his posture regaining a shred of its former, arrogant strength. The strength of a man who had nothing left to lose but the integrity of the system itself. They're waiting for the sequence to finish. If we fail, he gets my money and they get their payout. If we succeed. If you succeed, Vane said, looking at him with an unsettling intensity, you aren't just saving your fortune. You're proving that a machine can be outmaneuvered by the very person it was designed to bypass. You won't just be rich again, Mr. Thorne. You'll be a ghost in their own machine. Thorne looked at Sarah, then at Vane. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply crystallized into a cold, sharp-edged purpose. He wasn't thinking about the billions of dollars that were currently vanishing into the digital ether. He was thinking about the sheer, terrifying elegance of the trap and the impossible, absurd necessity of walking right back into its teeth to break it. We don't have much time, Sarah said, checking her small handheld scanner. The device was chirping a low-frequency warning, the signal of an approaching sweep. The local jamming is intensifying. They know we're still active in this sector. Thorne grabbed his coat, the weight of it feeling like armor. He looked at the handwritten ledgers on Vane's desk, the last vestiges of a world that made sense, and then toward the heavy steel door that led back to a world of light, glass, and certain destruction. Then let's go, Thorne said. We have a machine to break. The air in the executive core was thick with the smell of ozone and the low, predatory hum of server racks working at maximum capacity. It wasn't just the machines, it was the atmosphere of a killing floor. The office, once a temple to Thorne's absolute control, had been stripped of its elegance. Cables snaked across the polished marble like entrails, and the soft ambient lighting had been replaced by the harsh, flickering glare of emergency power. The architect, a man Thorne had known as Arthur Vance before he vanished into the shadow world of high-finance subversion, stood silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the shimmering sprawl of the city. He didn't look like a terrorist or a thief. He looked like a man who had finally achieved peace through total destruction. You're late, Elias, Vance said, his voice unnervingly calm over the roar of the cooling fans. The liquidation is already in its final phase. The first wave hit the Asian markets 10 minutes ago. By the time you reach the terminal, there won't be a system left to save. It will just be a collection of disconnected numbers in a vacuum. Thorne stepped into the light, flanked by Sarah and Vane. His suit was torn, his face smudged with the grime of the gray district, but his eyes were focused with a terrifying clarity. He wasn't looking at Vance. He was looking at the central terminal, the physical node where the dead man's hand was making its final handshake with the global ledger. The sequence isn't just about the money, Arthur, Thorne said, his voice gravelly but steady. You're not trying to steal it. You're trying to erase the very concept of value. You think you're resetting the world, but you're just burning the maps so no one can find their way home. A perfect reset, Vance countered, turning to face them. His eyes were bright with a manic, intellectual fervor. The system is too corrupt to be repaired, Elias. It requires a total thermal death. We wipe the slate, and we start again without the ghosts of your predatory credit cycles haunting us. Sarah didn't wait for the philosophy lesson to end. She moved toward the side terminal, her handheld scanner glowing a frantic blue. The handshake is accelerating. The rolling validation is hitting peak frequency. If we don't intercept this now, the biometric loop closes and becomes immutable. It'll be like trying to stop a landslide with a handful of sand. Vane, get to the manual bridge, Thorne commanded, stepping toward the primary interface. Sarah, I need you to isolate the NFC induction window. We have exactly one chance to inject the counter signal. Julian Vane moved with a strange, practiced efficiency. He didn't look like a man who had spent years hiding in the shadows. He looked like an engineer returning to a familiar, broken machine. He knelt by a heavy access panel at the base of the server rack, pulling a set of insulated grip pliers from his belt. This is going to be messy, Vane muttered, his eyes fixed on the exposed circuitry. The hardware bridge requires a direct physical connection to the induction coil. I have to bypass the secondary failsafes manually. There's high voltage discharge risk. If I misalign the contact even by a millimeter, it'll arc through my arm and fry the logic board before your signal even touches the wire. Do it, Thorne said. We don't have another option. As Vane began to strip the casing, Sarah turned to Thorne, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the settings on her device. Elias, there's a problem. The system is requesting the final biometric authorization for the terminal override. It's not just asking for a digital signature anymore. It's demanding a live, multi-point vascular scan through the sensor array. It needs to see you now. Thorne looked at the terminal. I can do that. You don't understand, Sarah said, her voice rising in pitch. The moment you provide that biometric data to override the sequence, your signature is permanently etched into this transaction. The system will flag you as the primary actor in a massive, illegal liquidation of assets. You won't be saving your wealth, you'll be legally responsible for its destruction. To the SEC, the DOJ, and every regulatory body on Earth, it will look like you triggered the cascade. Thorne looked at Vance. The man was watching him with a twisted sort of respect, waiting to see if his former friend would choose survival or salvation. If I don't do this, Thorne said, more to himself than to her, there won't be any laws left to care about anyway. He stepped up to the biometric scanner, a sleek, glass-topped sensor that sat atop the central console. He placed his hand on the surface. The machine hummed, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to pulse through his very bones. A red light scanned upward from his fingertips toward his wrist, tracing the intricate map of his veins in a searing, infrared glow. Authentication in progress, a synthesized voice announced. Identity confirmed, Elias Thorne. Final sequence authorization required. Now, Sarah. Thorne shouted, his eyes squeezed shut against the intensity of the red light. Sarah slammed her device into the interface port. Injecting the spoof signal. I'm layering the original Plaza handshake data over your live biometric stream. Come on, come on. At that moment, a violent crackle of blue electricity erupted from the floor panel where Vane was working. A sharp, metallic scent filled the room as an arc of high-voltage current jumped from the bridge to Vane's tool. He grunted, his teeth clenched in agony, but he didn't let go. He held the connection steady, his body acting as a human conduit for the massive surge required to force the signal through the hardware bottleneck. I have it. Vane roared over the scream of the electricity. The bridge is holding. Send it, Sarah. On the monitor, the progress bar for the dead man's hand began to plummet. The red digits, representing billions of dollars in liquidating assets, began to stutter and stall. Sequence interrupted. Error, invalid authentication loop detected, re-establishing handshake. It's fighting back. Sarah yelled, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The system is trying to reconcile your live biometric data with the spoofed signal I'm feeding it. It thinks there are two Eliases in the room. The logic gate is going to lock down if we don't synchronize them perfectly. Force the synchronization. Thorne commanded, his hand still pressed to the scanner. He could feel the heat from the sensor beginning to burn his skin. Use the wallet. Sarah grabbed the black leather wallet, the Trojan horse that had started this nightmare. She ripped open the lining, where she knew the silver-doped graphene filaments were hidden, and held it directly against the terminal's induction coil. I'm using the wallet as a signal amplifier. She cried. The graphene will act as a bridge for the counter frequency. I'm feeding the halt command through the very tool they used to infect us. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The room was filled with the deafening roar of fans, the crackle of electricity, and the frantic chirping of Sarah's alarms. Then a profound, sudden silence fell. The red light on the terminal turned to steady, calm amber. Sequence halted. Manual override successful. Transaction status, suspended pending regulatory review. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The hum of the servers dropped to a low idle. Vane collapsed back against the server rack, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands shaking uncontrollably from the electrical shock. Sarah slumped into her chair, the light of her screen casting long, tired shadows across her face. Thorne pulled his hand away from the scanner. His palm was red and stinging, a physical mark of what he had just done. He turned to look at Vance. The architect wasn't moving. He was staring at the terminal with an expression of profound, devastating loss. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had watched his masterpiece being erased by a single, clumsy brushstroke. "You've saved nothing," Vance whispered, his shoulders slumping. "You've only preserved a broken world. You've kept the chaos alive for another day." "I didn't save the money, Arthur," Thorne said, walking toward him as the sirens of security teams began to wail in the distance. Real ones this time, the kind that come with badges and handcuffs. "I just gave us a chance to fix it properly." "There's a difference." Thorne looked at his hands. They were shaking, too. He was still Elias Thorne, but the man who had walked into the plaza that morning felt like a stranger. He had won, but he had lost his anonymity, his untouchable status, and perhaps even his freedom. By overriding the system with his own biometric signature, he had effectively signed a confession to the very conspiracy he had just stopped. "They're coming," Vane said, standing up unsteadily. He looked at Thorne, a flicker of something like respect, or perhaps just recognition in his eyes. "The authorities, and probably the cleaners too. You've made yourself the most visible man in the world." Thorne nodded, looking out at the city. The lights were still flickering, and the digital pulse of the world was still erratic, but it was rhythmic again. It was breathing. "Let them come," Thorne said. "I'm tired of hiding in the shadows of my own empire." As the heavy security doors at the end of the hall began to hiss open, revealing a wall of tactical lights and armored figures, Thorne stood tall. He had broken the machine, but as he watched the red and blue lights flash against the glass, he realized that the real struggle, the one that mattered, was only just beginning. 3 months later, the world had not ended, but it had certainly changed. The Aegis Cascade was no longer a conspiracy theory whispered in dark corners of the internet. It was a landmark case study in international law and technological ethics. Arthur Vance's dead man's hand protocol had been dismantled piece by piece, though many of its underlying mechanisms remained hidden in the proprietary code of half a dozen different banks. Elias Thorne sat at a small, weathered wooden table at a waterfront cafe, far from the glass and steel towers of his former life. He was no longer the man who owned the skyline. He was a man under heavy supervision, his assets frozen and his movements monitored by a regulatory committee tasked with overseeing the fallout of the liquidation attempt. Across from him sat Julian Vane. Vane looked healthier than he had in the server room, though he still possessed that unsettling stillness, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has seen the ghost in the machine and survived it. He didn't carry a smartphone. He didn't even wear a smartwatch. He simply sat, hands folded on the table. "I heard you're setting up a foundation," Vane said, his voice cutting through the sound of the tide against the pier. "Not a hedge fund. Not a venture firm. A research institute." Thorne nodded, watching a seagull dive for something in the gray water. "The Thorne Institute for Digital Integrity. It's mostly academic for now. We're focusing on what Sarah calls physical-digital interfacing." Vane leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A fancy way of saying you're trying to build a wall between our bodies and our data." "No," Thorne corrected, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "The walls didn't work. Vance proved that. If you try to build a wall, someone will just find a way to tunnel under it, or use the foundation as a conductor. We have to stop treating digital security like it's something that happens in a cloud or on a server. It isn't. It's happening here." He tapped his temple, then pointed to the wallet sitting on the table between them, a simple, unbranded piece of brown leather. Vane looked at the wallet with a profound sense of caution. "The physical-digital bridge." "Exactly," Thorne said. "We spent decades perfecting the digital world. Encryption, firewalls, decentralized ledgers. We thought if we secured the code, we were safe. But we forgot that the bridge between the physical and the digital is incredibly fragile. Your body is a data source. Your proximity to an object is a handshake. A simple walk through a plaza can be a massive transfer of biometric identity if someone knows how to use ultra-wideband sensors to turn your very presence into a key." Vane nodded slowly. Most people still think a wallet is just a place for cards and cash. They don't realize it's a piece of hardware that connects them to the entire global financial grid via proximity. That's the realization, Thorne said. The dinner table test, as Sarah calls it. Most people assume that being robbed means losing your money. But in this new era, you can be robbed without ever touching your pocket. You can be liquidated while you're simply standing next to someone who wants to erase you. Our physical presence has become a permanent part of our digital identity, and because that connection is so seamless, it's also incredibly lethal. It turns the world into a field of invisible triggers. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. Thorne looked out at the horizon. He had lost his empire, his reputation for invincibility, and his privacy. In exchange, he had gained a terrifyingly clear view of the world as it actually was, an interconnected web of signals where every physical movement could be translated into a digital consequence. Do you regret it? Vane asked quietly. The manual override. Giving yourself away to save a system that's still fundamentally broken. Thorne looked at his hands. The skin was healed, but the memory of the sting remained. He thought about the millions of people who would go through their day tomorrow, walking through plazas and sitting in cafes, completely unaware that the very air around them was thick with data harvesting currents, waiting for a handshake to trigger a cascade. I used to think wealth was about how much you could control, Thorne said. The ability to command markets and dictate terms. But after everything, I realized that true security isn't about control. It's about understanding the connection. We aren't just users of technology anymore, Julian. We are part of its architecture. He stood up, leaving a few coins on the table, real, physical currency. A gesture that felt almost archaic in the world they had survived. As he walked away along the pier, Thorne didn't look back. He wasn't looking for shadows or cameras anymore. He was simply walking, mindful of the space he occupied, aware of the invisible threads connecting him to every stranger passing by in the wind.